The British Museum behind me holds a huge number of discoveries that confirm the historical accuracy of the Bible. All the major exhibits can be toured in just 2 hours, so let's go and see the important evidence for ourselves. From around 880 BC, the Assyrian Empire really began to take shape, bringing terror and tyranny for nearly 3 centuries and engulfing many other kingdoms. Assyrian kings threatened and invaded the Bible lands of Israel and Judah, securing submission and tribute from them. Many years of such interaction naturally led to various names and battles being mentioned in both the Bible and the annals and monuments of the Assyrians, confirming the historical accuracy of the biblical record. In the Assyrian Sculpture Gallery at the British Museum is an Assyrian monument mentioning the names of 2 kings who feature prominently in the Old Testament. 3 similar monuments stand together. The one in the middle commemorates Ashurnasirpal II, the Assyrian king who began the policy of expansion and empire building. He introduced new siege techniques to Assyrian warfare, particularly the use of earth ramparts and battering engines, supported by sling-shooters and archers. The extreme barbarity of this king towards his rebels and defeated enemies exceeds anything in history. Nearby bas-reliefs from his throne room at the palace feature the king hunting and campaigning. To the left of him is a sandy-coloured monument of tremendous importance to us. It is known as the Stele of Shalmaneser III, also called the Kirk Stele. This shows Shalmaneser, who ruled Assyria after Ashurnasirpal, saluting his gods, symbolised in the small pictures above his hand. Writing appears all over the king's picture and also on the back of the monument. This text describes Shalmaneser's first 6 military campaigns, including specific mention of Ahab, king of Israel, and Ben-Hadad I, king of Syria. He records how in 853 BC he ventured west, threatening many kingdoms, but the king of Hamath organised a mighty defence force supplied by 12 kings, Ahab and Ben-Hadad being among them. These 2 spent most of their time at war with each other, but during a 3-year peace mentioned in 1 Kings 22, they joined forces with Hamath to repel Shalmaneser. This was during the ministry of the prophet Elisha. An engagement was fought at Karkara near Hamath. In this monument, Shalmaneser describes it in these words: "I approached Karkara. I destroyed, tore down and bound Karkara, his royal residence. He brought along to help him 1,200 chariots, 1,200 cavalrymen, 20,000 foot soldiers belonging to Ben-Hadad of Damascus, 2,000 chariots, 10,000 foot soldiers belonging to Ahab the Israelite." The text records that the whole Confederate army had 50,000 infantry, 14,000 cavalry, and nearly 4,000 chariots. Shalmaneser boasts that he won such a great victory that the rivers were dammed with corpses and the valleys flowed with blood. But his victory could not have been quite as dramatic as this, because his advance was effectively halted and he never took possession of his enemy's territory. Nor does the Bible mention that either Ahab or Ben-Hadad suffered a military setback on such a scale. Shortly after this event, Ahab returned to the offensive against Ben-Hadad and died on the battlefield, as recorded in 1 Kings 22. Such inscriptions as these provide definite confirmation that the various people described in Kings and Chronicles were true historical figures. Just in front of the Kirk stele is the black obelisk, which provides the only known picture of a Hebrew king. It is a black limestone pillar about 2 meters tall, with 4 sides covered with pictures and writing, recording, among other things, how Jehu, king of Israel, paid homage to Shalmaneser. Jehu is named and shown prostrating himself before him, and the text states the value of the homage. I received from him silver, gold, a golden bowl, golden goblets, pitchers of gold, tin, a staff for the hand of the king. After the death of Ahab, king of Israel, in 853 BC, his son Ahaziah ruled for 2 years, dying prematurely in 852 BC. Then another son, Joram, ruled for 10 years. This was an intensely evil reign, and in 841 BC, a military captain named Jehu was anointed king of Israel by Elisha's messenger and commanded to destroy the Ahab dynasty. Jehu took a chariot to the town of Jezreel, where Ahab's son, King Joram, recovering from battle wounds, was accompanied by another Ahaziah, the 21-year-old king of Judah, a hopeless and wicked individual. Jehu's chariot raised such a cloud of dust that the Jezreel town watchman thought it was a large company approaching. However, as Jehu drew nearer, he reported, "The driving is like the driving of Jehu, for he driveth furiously." Jehu shot Joram with an arrow as he tried to escape, and also fatally wounded Ahaziah. He entered the town and found the notorious Jezebel, Ahab's widow, who had painted her face and was looking out of an upper window. He ordered her to be unceremoniously thrown out of the window to her death, and dogs ate her flesh. Jehu set about purging Baal worship out of Israel with considerable cunning and violence, exterminating all the failed royal house of Israel and the priests of Baal. All this is recorded in 2 Kings 9 and 10. Jehu went on to reign for 28 years, beginning a dynasty of some 100 years. From this obelisk, we learn that Jehu, in the first year of his reign, attempted to buy the friendship of Assyria by paying homage to Shalmaneser III. In this monument, discovered in 1845 at Nimrud, the existence of yet another Bible king receives solid corroboration from a contemporary secular record. Assyrian kings flanked the entrances to their royal palaces with colossal, human-headed winged bulls and lions. These were designed to project an image of intelligence and power, and to signify the emperor's extensive dominions. These huge, human-headed winged lions from Nimrud guarded the palaces of several kings who invaded and oppressed Bible lands, including Ashurnasirpal and Shalmaneser. The walled city of Nimrud covered 890 acres. The palace alone covered 50 acres, building activities lasting 50 years. The huge gates of Balawat, a secondary palace built for Shalmaneser III, were decorated with bands of engraved bronze. One of these bronze bands features the military expedition against Karkara by Ashurnasirpal. Chariots are shown attacking the region of Hamath, and below, captives are being led away. These monuments are typical of so much which has been unearthed, confirming the biblical characters lived at the times and in the places stated in the Bible. There were three significant Assyrian capitals: Nimrud, Khorsabad, and Nineveh. The Assyrian capital was moved to Nimrud by Ashurnasirpal II about 880 BC, and this continued to be the capital for 170 years. When Shalmaneser III ascended the throne, he added the secondary palace at nearby Balawat. It was not until Sargon II ascended the throne that Nimrud ceased to be the capital of Assyria, Sargon building a new palace for himself at Khorsabad. Khorsabad, however, lasted for only one reign, because Sargon's son Sennacherib moved the capital to Nineveh. This remained the capital through the reigns of 5 more kings, until its destruction by the Chaldeans in 612 BC. After the death of the Assyrian Emperor Shalmaneser III in 824 BC, nearly 80 years passed without serious trouble between Assyria and Palestine. Then in 745 BC, an Assyrian general seized power, assuming the lordly name of Tiglath-Pileser III and resuming the aggressive policies of Shalmaneser III. Tiglath invaded Israel twice during his reign and is mentioned 9 times in the Bible. His portrait in stone is close to the Nimrud Palace reliefs in the museum. Another relief depicts the chariot of Tiglath-Pileser III. The first of Tiglath's invasions is recorded in 2 Kings 15, where he is called Pul. At the time, Israel's king was Menahem. The Bible says, Pul, the king of Assyria, came against the land, and Menahem gave Pul 1,000 talents of silver, that his hand might be with him. And Menahem exacted the money of Israel, even of all the mighty men of wealth, of each man 50 shekels of silver. So the king of Assyria turned back. Tiglath-Pileser's own annals say, As for Menahem, I overwhelmed him like a snowstorm, and he fled like a bird alone and bowed to my feet. I returned him to his place and imposed tribute upon him. In Israel, Pekah, a military commander, succeeded Menahem, beginning to reign in Israel in 740 BC, following a murderous coup. Within a few years, he joined forces with Rezin, the king of Syria, and began to attack Judah. Down in Judah, King Ahaz ignored Isaiah's advice and refused to look to God for help. Consequently, the Israel-Syria alliance wounded Judah severely, slaying 120,000 men and taking many captives. In desperation, Ahaz turned to Tiglath-Pileser of Assyria and paid him to come to his rescue. His message read, I am thy servant and thy son. Come up and save me out of the hand of the king of Syria and out of the hand of the king of Israel, which rise up against me. And Ahaz took the silver and gold found in the house of the Lord and in the treasures of the king's house, and sent it to the king of Assyria. And the king of Assyria went up against Damascus and took it and slew Rezin. This limestone relief in the Assyrian sculpture gallery tells of the capture of Astatu, a place in Gilead east of the river Jordan. It commemorates Tiglath's second invasion of Israel between 734 and 732 BC. The king is shown at the bottom, while above him booty and Israelite prisoners are being led away. This totally corroborates the biblical record of 2 Kings 15, which reads, In the days of Pekah, king of Israel, came Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, and took Hazor and Gilead and Galilee, all the lands of Naphtali, and carried them captive to Assyria. So in 732 BC, the alliance of Pekah of Israel and Rezin of Damascus, Syria, was broken. Damascus fell, and the long history of the kingdom of Syria was brought to an end. As for Pekah, at precisely the same time, he fell victim to a conspiracy at home when Hoshea put him to death and took the throne. Tiglath-Pileser's annals confirm all this. In an inscription, he tells how Ahaz of Judah paid him an enormous tax of royal treasure: gold, silver, lead, tin, iron, woolen goods, linen, purple, trained horses and mules. Tiglath also gives details of how he took Syria, conquering all the way to Damascus. He tells of how King Rezin fled into the city, and how amidst scenes of devastation and destruction, Rezin's advisors were impaled. Tiglath-Pileser's annals also refer to the assassination of Pekah, claiming a part in the conspiracy in these words: "They overthrew their king, Pekah, and I placed Hoshea over them as king." The historical nature of the biblical narrative could not be more comprehensively confirmed. Tiglath was succeeded by Shalmaneser V, and in 2 Kings 17 we read of how Hoshea, king of Israel, initially submitted to the yoke of Shalmaneser and paid tribute to him. Before long, however, Hoshea stopped paying the tribute and appealed to Egypt to help him resist Assyria. Shalmaneser reacted by seizing Hoshea, imprisoning him, and laying siege to the city of Samaria. It fell after 3 years in 722 BC, immediately after Shalmaneser had died and been succeeded by Sargon II. Sargon II is therefore the Assyrian emperor who claims to have directed the final fall, punishment, and captivity of the kingdom of Israel, following centuries of warning from the prophets. Sargon's records confirm the biblical account of the fall of Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel, in 722 BC. This great sculpture from Sargon's palace at Khorsabad shows the king on the left receiving a nobleman, most probably Crown Prince Sennacherib, his son. So the 10 northern tribes of Israel went into captivity, leaving only the southern kingdom of Judah in freedom. Samaria had withstood the siege for 3 years due to its unusually strong fortifications. Excavations show that 40 to 50 years before the siege of 722 BC, King Jeroboam had given the city a double wall with an overall thickness of up to 32 feet. Nevertheless, as the Bible says in 2 Kings 17, Samaria fell because of the wickedness of the people. And the king of Assyria took Samaria and carried Israel away into Assyria. And the king of Assyria brought men from Babylon, and from Cuthah, and from Avar, and from Hamath, and from Sepharvaim, and placed them in the cities of Samaria instead of the children of Israel. Sargon II took the credit for the fall of Samaria. In several inscriptions on prisms now held in the British Museum, the Louvre, Paris, and the Iraq Museum, Baghdad. One says, "In the first year of my reign, I besieged and conquered Samaria, and carried away 27,290 inhabitants." Another says, "I surrounded and deported as prisoners 27,290 of its inhabitants. From them I equipped 200 chariots for my own army units. I restored the city of Samaria. I brought into it people from the countries conquered by my own hands. The precision of the biblical narrative is thus totally vindicated by several ancient documents. The people brought into Samaria to replace Israelites were Assyrian prisoners taken from Babylon and northern Syria. These gave rise to new languages and customs with much religious confusion. The result was the cult of the Samaritans, from whom the mainstream Jews of Judah stood aloof. The name of Sargon II was unknown outside the Bible until his palace at Khorsabad was discovered in 1843. One after another, the alleged mythical figures of the Bible have been revealed as true people by the archaeologist Spade. The museum's Lachish room displays one of the most spectacular confirmations of Bible history ever unearthed. Indeed, these items from the Palace of Nineveh were the very first direct proof found of an event in Bible history when discovered in 1847. Sennacherib, king of Assyria, was even more aggressive than his father Sargon II. In 701 BC, he swept into Judah with a massive army and proceeded to capture all her fortress cities. At the time, Isaiah was resident prophet in Jerusalem, and Hezekiah was king. Sennacherib's encounter with the outstanding and godly Hezekiah receives considerable coverage in the Bible. It is also one of the best documented events in the Assyrian records. Sennacherib's chronicles were found at Nineveh together with the pictures in stone which lined the walls of his 71-roomed palace. The Bible tells us that Hezekiah had refused to serve and pay the king of Assyria in 2 Kings 18. Sennacherib's anger was aroused. Now in the 14th year of King Hezekiah, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the walled cities of Judah and took them. And Hezekiah sent to the king of Assyria at Lachish, saying, I have offended, return from me. Whatever penalty you impose on me, I will bear. And the king of Assyria imposed on Hezekiah 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. Also, Hezekiah gave him all the silver that was in the house of the Lord, and the treasures of the king's house. The tribute imposed upon Hezekiah amounted to 22,500 pounds weight of silver and 2,250 pounds of gold. Just outside the Lachish room is a very large stone slab covered in text. It is badly scorched because nearly 100 years after Sennacherib's invasion in 612 BC, Nineveh was destroyed by fire, just as Nahum had prophesied. The text gives details of the tribute sent by Hezekiah to the Assyrians and accounted for after the campaign. Despite having extracted this enormous payment, Sennacherib evidently decided to continue with his attempt to sack Jerusalem and sent his senior commander to say so while he continued to besiege Lachish, the last fortified city on the main road to Jerusalem from the southwest, just 30 miles away. Sennacherib's annals in the famous Taylor Prism mainly agree with the Bible's account of the conflict. This 6-sided baked clay prism, kept upstairs in the museum's room 55, is the definitive last record of Sennacherib. It says, "As for Hezekiah the Jew, who did not submit to my yoke, 46 of his strong walled cities, by escalade and by bringing up siege engines, by attacking and storming, by mines, tunnels and breaches, I besieged and took. 200,150 people, horses, cattle and sheep without number, I brought away." Hezekiah himself, like a caged bird, I shut up in Jerusalem, his royal city. Earthworks I threw up against him. The one coming out of his city gate, I turned back to his misery. As for Hezekiah, the terrifying splendor of my majesty overcame him, and his mercenary troops deserted him. In addition to 30 talents of gold and 800 talents of silver, I took gems, antimony, jewels, ivory, valuable treasures, as well as his daughters, his harem, his male and female musicians, which I sent to Nineveh, my royal city. The Bible and Sennacherib's inscriptions agree that precisely 46 walled cities of Judah fell, that Lachish also fell, that Hezekiah was shut up in Jerusalem by events, and that 30 talents of gold were paid in tribute, though the precise amount of silver and other items are in dispute. They also agree that Jerusalem itself did not fall, the mighty Assyrian army leaving the area without an engagement there. In the Bible's account, Sennacherib's army was destroyed by the angel of the Lord, while the Assyrian version on the Taylor Prism gives implicit acknowledgement that Jerusalem remained intact. Sennacherib did not care to record the destruction of his army. Jerusalem never fell, and so Sennacherib had to be content with Lachish as the subject of his sculptures. Furthermore, he never returned to the region of Palestine, doubtless due to the severity of his losses. The Bible relates how Hezekiah made thorough preparations for a seemingly inevitable siege of Jerusalem. He prayed for God's help, and Isaiah gave him a word from the Lord, assuring him of deliverance. All this is recorded in detail in 2 Kings, 2 Chronicles, and Isaiah. There was an interlude when Sennacherib was called away to deal with an offensive by Tirhakah, then crown prince or king regent of Ethiopia. It must have been on its return that the Assyrian army was destroyed before it ever reached the walls of Jerusalem. One night the angel of the Lord went out and smote in the camp of the Assyrians 185,000. So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed. The Lachish room gives a very vivid idea of the barbaric and terrifying siege warfare employed by Sennacherib. The sculptured slabs arranged round this gallery once constituted the wallpaper of one of the palace rooms. They depict the story of the siege and conquest of Lachish. Slingshooters are seen behind the assault force, while in front of them are the archers, and then the stormtroopers. Siege engines are being rushed up the massive artificial earth ramparts, which were thrown up under shield cover to effectively reduce the height of the walls. Defenders throw down flaming torches and rocks. The sculptures show the battle raging on the left of the city and the result on the right. A chariot and other items are shown being carried out of the city, along with numerous prisoners, including carts with families and small children. Dead defenders are shown spiked on poles and paraded about to demoralize others. Some prisoners are being tortured, flayed until the muscles are visible. On the end wall of the gallery, Sennacherib is seen on a portable throne, receiving the surrender of the city. An inscription reads, "Sennacherib, supreme king, king of Assyria, sits upon a throne while the booty of Lachish passes before him." The men behind Sennacherib hold fly whisks. The king's face has been damaged by subsequent vandalism. In a wall case, there is a collection of slingstones and arrowheads found at the excavation of Lachish itself. Another 8-sided Assyrian prism records 5 of Sennacherib's campaigns, including the capture of Lachish. A modern artist's impression of the siege is nearby. Another fact confirmed in Assyrian records is the biblical account of how Sennacherib returned to Nineveh only to be slain by 2 of his sons as he worshipped in his idol temple. The Bible also records how these sons fled to Armenia, leaving another son, Esarhaddon, to pursue and defeat them, and subsequently to be crowned king. Esarhaddon's records say, "In the month of Nisanu, a grim determination fell upon my brothers. They forsook the gods and turned themselves to deeds of violence, scheming evil. To seize power, they slew Sennacherib their father." With so much archaeological confirmation of the biblical record, we must not lose sight of Isaiah, the towering teacher of the time. He foretold in great detail, 700 years beforehand, how the Messiah would come and suffer to atone for human sin. He spoke of Christ's resurrection, the founding of his church, and its worldwide spread. His numerous, very precise predictions given in soaring prose have been proved correct, verifying the unique and inspired nature of the Bible. But the prophet's chief concern was that individuals should find forgiveness and be reconciled with God. In connection with Hezekiah and Sennacherib, one other feature of the Bible narrative must be mentioned, though nothing is currently on display at the museum on this. The Bible describes how in 701 BC, Hezekiah, in his preparation for siege by Sennacherib's army, blocked up water sources outside the city and diverted the Gihon spring via a tunnel to run into the city, recorded in 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles. This 1,748-foot-long tunnel was pickaxed out of solid limestone rock. About 6 feet high for most of its length, it lies deep below the surface and leads to the pool of Siloam, which was made at the same time. The tunnel was hewn out by 2 teams working from opposite ends. On completion, a commemorative plaque was set into the wall at the point where the workmen met. The tunnel was discovered by Edward Robinson, an American Orientalist, in 1838 and cleared in 1909 to 1911. The inscription, which was found in 1880, describes the completion of the tunnel and is exhibited in the Archaeological Museum in Istanbul. It reads, "This is the way the tunnel was cut through. While there remained 6 cubits to cut through, the voice of one workman was heard calling to his fellow. And when the tunnel was driven through, the workman struck each toward his fellow, axe against axe, and the water flowed from the spring to the reservoir for 1,200 cubits, and the height of the rock above the head of the workman was 100 cubits. Hezekiah's tunnel, also called the Siloam Tunnel, is the prince of the 3 ancient water systems serving Jerusalem, being by far the longest and deepest of them. An astonishing engineering achievement completed at breakneck speed, it still defies explanation as to how the workmen digging from opposite ends met in the middle, and how they obtained ventilation. It is the longest ancient water tunnel lacking intermediate shafts. Some geologists had claimed that the tunnel was built in the 2nd century AD, but in 2003, the scientific journal Nature published the work of leading geologists, affirming an 8th century BC date. This was established by radiocarbon dating of fragments of vegetation in the lime plaster lining. This lining was necessary to prevent water loss through fissures in the hewn limestone rock and was up to 8 inches thick. The tunnel is almost level, descending only 12.5 inches in the course of its 1,748-foot length, delivering water to the Siloam pool. The depth of the tunnel reaches 150 feet. It follows a serpentine track, a feature giving rise to several plausible explanations, ranging from the need to avoid underpassing the holy ground of the royal tombs above to geological constraints. Hezekiah's son Manasseh was in turn oppressed by Sennacherib's son Esarhaddon, some of whose records are held at the museum. He invaded Judah with other territories, imposing painfully heavy tributes of building materials, together with gold and silver, for the rebuilding of his palace at Nineveh. There was no divine deliverance for Manasseh as there had been for his father, because he had brought back gross idolatry. The Bible says in 2 Chronicles 33, "So Manasseh made Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem to err, and to do worse than the heathen. Wherefore the Lord brought upon them the captains of the host of the king of Assyria." This inscribed baked clay prism of Esarhaddon, held at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, describes his invasion, naming Manasseh. "I called up the kings of the Hatti land, and of the regions on the other side of the river Euphrates, Balu, king of Tyre, Manasseh, king of Judah." He names 20 other rulers. "All these I sent out, and made them transport under terrible difficulties to Nineveh building materials for my palace, large logs, long beams, boards of cedar and pine, and from their quarries in the mountains statues of deities made of stone, slabs of limestone, Asnan stone, large and small-grained breccia." At a later stage, Manasseh was taken into captivity by Esarhaddon's son. The Nineveh Palace Reliefs Gallery contains stone reliefs from the 2 sides of a courtyard of the southwest palace at Nineveh. Among these reliefs, we see the much photographed picture of a Phoenician ship, or ship of Tarshish. Such a ship did not necessarily come from Tarshish, which may have been a distant Mediterranean place, possibly a port in Spain. The term described any ocean-going galley or man of war with a long prow for ramming. Such ships are referred to several times in the Bible. Most famously, Jonah boarded a ship going to Tarshish. The scenes here chiefly show the transferring of the human-headed bulls of the palace doors from the quarries where they were fashioned. At the end of the gallery on the left is a war scene, full of fear and tension, showing archers and siege troops poised to attack a city, but not Jerusalem, as is sometimes suggested. But the days of the Assyrian Empire were numbered. The evidence of burning is to be seen here on some of the stone reliefs, for Nineveh fell in 612 BC, as the prophet Nahum had predicted at some time during the preceding 50 years, by fire and flood. "Fire shall devour thee," said Nahum. He also said that the gates of the rivers would be opened, so that the palaces would be dissolved. When the Babylonians took the city, they set fire to it and caused the Kosa River to flood the palace. The Babylonian Chronicle for this period confirms the collapse of the Assyrian Empire and the fall of Nineveh, its mighty capital city, to the Babylonians. Impregnable and powerful though it seemed, the city was humiliated and devastated. It tells how the Babylonians, with their allies, attacked Nineveh in 612 BC. It includes the following sentences. Nabopolassar of Babylon called out his army. The king of the Medes crossed and marched along the bank of the river Tigris and camped against Nineveh. A great attack they mounted. A great defeat of this dominant people was made. Great spoil of the city and temple they carried away, and the city was reduced to a mount of ruin and heaps of debris. And so the mighty Assyrian Empire came to an end. Upstairs, in room 57 of the museum, known as the Gallery of Ancient Levant, we find several magnificent exhibits confirming Bible history. On the right-hand side, just as you enter the gallery from the stairway, is a very large storage jar of great significance. It comes from the city of Hazor, Tel El-Kedar, located 10 miles north of the Sea of Galilee. It was the largest Canaanite city prior to Joshua's conquest in 1406 BC. Excavations indicate it had 40,000 inhabitants. This jar, however, was made in the 1300s BC, after Joshua's burning of the city, described in Joshua chapter 11. The likelihood is that this jar, along with other Canaanite pottery of the 14th and 13th centuries BC displayed elsewhere in the museum, shows that the city was reoccupied by the Canaanites after Joshua's conquest, as the Bible says. Certainly Joshua did not occupy it, but left it abandoned. Joshua 11:13 says that defeated cities stood still on their mounds, as the literal Hebrew has it. The Canaanite reoccupation lasted until the time of the Judges. Judges chapter 4 tells us that Jabin was king of Canaan, that reigned in Hazor, the captain of whose host was Sisera. In 1235 BC, Deborah and Barak took back the region and the city, as recorded in Judges chapters 4 and 5. In the 1950s, excavations at Hazor by Professor Yigael Yardin found signs of violent destruction and abandonment in the 1200s BC, as well as easily datable pottery. The Canaanite reoccupation had clearly come to an end. A twofold conquest of Hazor by Israelites, with around 160 years of resumed Canaanite occupation in between, fits these findings. Also in the gallery are several Amarna letters. In 1887, a store of 382 ancient letters was discovered in Egypt at the site of Tel El Amarna. These clay tablets had been written to two pharaohs, Amenophis III and Amenophis IV, over a period from 1390 BC. The senders were officials and kinglets of the Canaanite cities of Palestine, about the time that Joshua and the children of Israel were settling in the land. Palestine was then part of the Egyptian Empire. Soon after 1380 BC, Amenophis IV, also spelled Amenhotep, moved the Egyptian capital, together with the Foreign Office files relating to his father's reign, from Thebes to Amarna. Many of the letters referred to impending invasions and hostilities by the Epiru and by another group which is thought to be a code logogram for the same people. In all probability, the Epiru were not strictly the Israelites, but a marauding nomadic people who had been in Canaan before the arrival of the Israelites. But to the Canaanites, the Israelites were the same as the Epirus, this having become a term for any unsettled and hostile group. Conservative scholars, therefore, equate the Epirus with the Israelites, who had by this time arrived in the land, had completed their initial conquests, and were taking other cities. The governor of Jerusalem wrote several letters to Pharaoh, pleading for help to resist these invaders. In one he cries, "The Epirus plunder all the lands of the king. If archers are here this year, then the lands of the king my lord will remain. But if the archers are not here, then the lands of the king my lord are lost. All the lands of the king my lord are going to ruin." Pharaoh Amenophis made no response to such appeals, not being greatly interested in his Palestine possessions. According to the dating information of the Bible, Joshua entered the Promised Land around 1406 BC. The Amarna letters tell us about the state of Palestine after the entry of Joshua into the land, not before it. The book of Joshua refers to 31 independent city-states that had their own kings. As Dr. John J. Davis points out, the success of Israel brought about the end of many of the independent states, thus leaving only a few self-sufficient political entities in southern Canaan. The Amarna letters confirm this picture of Joshua's work, for they reflect the survival of only 4 independent city-states with their own kings. The Stela of Merneptah, or the Israel stele, a 7.5-foot tall basalt stela, carries the earliest mention of Israel outside Scripture. Pharaoh Merneptah mounted a campaign to Canaan around 1231 BC, in the time of the Judges. Here he claims, "Israel is laid waste, bare of seed." This inscription shows that Israel, as an ethnic group, was well settled in Canaan by this time. Merneptah's invasion is not mentioned in the Bible and is thought to have affected only the Jezreel area, if carried out at all. This monument is in the Cairo Museum, and alongside the Amarna letters confirms the settlement of the Israelites in the land of Canaan, in accordance with the books of Exodus, Joshua, and Judges. Also displayed in a wall case in the gallery of the ancient Levant, belonging to a period over 5 centuries after Joshua's conquest, is a panel bearing several pieces of carved ivory found in 1931 to 1935 at Ahab's royal palace in Samaria. Now the rest of the acts of Ahab, and all that he did, and the ivory house which he made, and all the cities that he built, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel? Whether these particular examples were made for him or a successor is uncertain. But the prophet Amos said that God would destroy the houses of ivory and condemn those who lie upon beds of ivory. Ahab's ivory house at Samaria was so called because of the carved and inlaid ivory friezes and embellishments throughout the palace. The craftsmen were Phoenician, and the ivory came from Syrian elephants. Some entire walls were covered with carved ivory paneling, while similar ornamentation decorated the furniture. Ahab's wife Jezebel, a Phoenician princess from Tyre, would have revelled in this, as Ahab lavished such excesses upon his royal buildings. The Gallery of Ancient Levant also houses the Lachish letters. These letters take us back to 586 BC. Nineveh, the capital of the mighty Assyrian Empire, had fallen to the Babylonians some 25 years earlier. Now Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, invades Judah, destroying Jerusalem and its temple with great violence and carrying multitudes into captivity. At the time, the prophet Jeremiah was in Jerusalem, warning King Zedekiah of the impending catastrophe. Near to Jerusalem was the fortress town of Lachish, destroyed by Sennacherib over a century before, but later rebuilt. These letters were found in 1935 in the ruins of a guardroom by the main gate of Lachish. 21 letters were found, written in joined-up writing, in black ink, on pieces of broken pottery. Written in alphabetic Hebrew, they are urgent messages, full of 11th hour tension, written as Nebuchadnezzar's army closed in on a very apprehensive Jerusalem. The writer was Hoshayahu, or Hoshea, the commander of a military outpost or small town garrison. He wrote to the Lachish military governor, whose name was Yaosh, or Josiah. Jeremiah 34 mentions that Jeremiah delivered a message to King Zedekiah while the cities of Lachish and Azekah still remained standing. The letter here reads, "May Yahweh cause my Lord to hear this very day tidings of good. I report that we are watching for the fire signals of Lachish according to the directions which my Lord has given, because we cannot see Azekah. It is possible that Azekah had fallen." Another Lachish letter logs the departure of a deputation to Egypt and also includes the following: "And as for the letter of Tobiah, servant of the king, which came to Shallum, son of Jaddua, through the prophet, saying, Beware, thy servant hath sent it to my Lord." Who was the prophet referred to here? It is likely to have been Jeremiah. This is the first known mention of a Jewish prophet outside the Bible. In another letter, the complaint is made that the words of the princes are not good, but they weaken our hands and slacken the hands of those who hear about them. This was the very charge which the princes made against Jeremiah when they demanded his execution in Jeremiah 38 verse 4. "Let this man be put to death, for thus he weakeneth the hands of the men of war." Hoshea, the outpost commander, was clearly in sympathy with Jeremiah in seeing that the policy of the princes, relying on Egypt, would bring certain defeat and devastation. The Lachish letters confirm powerfully the historical reality of the biblical record, including the situation in the city reflected in the book of the prophet Jeremiah. Jeremiah the prophet, in one of the most graphic books in the Bible, warns and pleads with people to seek their individual spiritual salvation as the land would fall. No prophet uses more illustrations in his preaching. With great feeling, he reasons with individuals to seek and find God in a personal way. He predicts the coming of Christ, who would be divine and who would make a way of forgiveness for all who trust in him. Jeremiah calls Christ the Lord our righteousness, referring to our need of a Saviour who would take on our behalf the punishment of our sin and offer his own perfect righteousness to make us acceptable to God. The prophet also accurately predicted the 70-year captivity of the Jews in Babylon, and the detailed future of other nations, all of which has taken place. Next to the Gallery of Ancient Levant is the Gallery of Early Mesopotamia, the home of artifacts from the royal tombs at Ur, dated around 2500 BC. Excavations at Ur were carried out by Sir Leonard Woolley between 1922 and 1934, the city having been discovered in 1854. The very existence of Ur was denied by critics of the Bible prior to its discovery. In the materials from these excavations, there is no direct evidence of the presence of Abraham's family, but they entirely confirm the descriptive language of the Genesis record. The city was clearly an extremely wealthy and sophisticated place, and the royal tombs of Ur have yielded up magnificent treasures. According to the Bible, Abraham grew up in or outside the city during the 22nd century BC. The Ur excavations centered on the great ziggurat, a temple to the moon god. The city had two-storied houses, main drainage, and a commercial system based on written contracts, money, receipts, and similar tokens of a trading system. The exhibits in this room help us to appreciate the kind of advanced but idolatrous civilization out of which Abraham was called by God. Several beautiful objects of art also illustrate the authenticity of biblical descriptions, although they predate the time of Abraham. The depiction of an army, or as it used to be thought, a wealthy family on the move, helps us picture the long journey of Abraham and his family. This is the royal standard of Ur. The army is on one side and the booty parade on the other. The statuette of a ram made of gold, silver, lapis and shell depicts a ram caught in a thicket. Two like this were discovered. For this to have been the subject of an artist shows that this situation was not so rare. Once again, the statue predates the offering of Isaac, but helps to authenticate the narrative. Around the room are displayed many other interesting items from the Abrahamic period. The royal tombs contain the famous Queen's lyre, a reconstruction of which is on display here. There are impressive items of literature, advanced mathematics and science, and evidence of widespread literacy among the people. A recipe for glass is displayed nearby, from which Pilkingtons once successfully made small cups. The exhibits help the viewer to appreciate the advanced culture of Ur and the great test of faith for Abraham when he left in all probability a secure house, forsook all, and set out for the land which God would show him. Among the most impressive items in the museum verifying Bible history are the sensational Babylonian Chronicles, the records of the Babylonian kings who took the mantle of empire after the collapse of Assyria. Covering the period from 615 to 539 BC, these inscribed clay tablets substantiate many events. They provide details of the accessions and deaths of Babylonian kings, together with the main events in each year of their reign. First, there is the Babylonian Chronicle for the period 615 to 609 BC, mentioned already in a previous program. This Babylonian Chronicle confirms the collapse of the Assyrian Empire and the fall of Nineveh its mighty capital city, to the Babylonians. In the Bible, Nahum and Zephaniah had predicted the fall of Nineveh, and Jeremiah recorded it. Impregnable and powerful though it seemed, Nahum described the city's coming humiliation and devastation, referring particularly to massacre and devouring fire. We have already seen the scorching on some Assyrian sculptures. This Babylonian chronicle tells how the Babylonians, with their allies, attacked Nineveh in 612 BC. It includes the following sentences. Nabopolassar of Babylon called out his army. The king of the Medes crossed and marched along the bank of the river Tigris and camped against Nineveh. A great attack they mounted. A great defeat of this dominant people was made. Great spoil of the city and temple they carried away. And the city was reduced to a mount of ruin and heaps of debris. The presence of Egyptian troops in the Euphrates region in 609 BC, referred to in 2 Kings 23 and 2 Chronicles 35, is also confirmed by this chronicle. The 2 Kings verse says, "In his days Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, went up against," this should read alongside, "the king of Assyria to the river Euphrates, and King Josiah went against him." Josiah, one of the best kings of Judah, here made a fatal mistake. After the fall of Nineveh, Egypt went to the aid of the crumbling Assyrians, and Josiah, contrary to all warnings, got involved and led his army to Megiddo, where Pharaoh Necho killed him. The Babylonian chronicle, covering the year 609 BC, confirms the Egyptian presence in the region at this time, when there was a skirmish for the city of Haran, where the Assyrian king had fled after the fall of Nineveh. The chronicle says, "In the month Ayu of his 16th year, Nabopolassar of Babylon called out his army and marched to Assyria, and marched after Ashur-uballit, king of Assyria, to Haran. Fear fell on him and on the army of Egypt which had come to his help. They abandoned the city." Next, there is the Babylonian chronicle for the first 11 years of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, 605 to 594 BC. This confirms the biblical record of the Battle of Carchemish and the siege of Jerusalem. The Bible says that in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, Josiah's son, Pharaoh Necho came again to help the dying Assyrian Empire withstand the Babylonians. Jeremiah had previously prophesied that Nebuchadnezzar would win all his battles against Assyria and Egypt and would then take Judah into captivity for 70 years. When the Egyptian army clashed with the Babylonian army under the generalship of Crown Prince Nebuchadnezzar, the result was the slaughter of the Egyptians at Carchemish. At this time, Nebuchadnezzar also besieged Jerusalem. Daniel chapter 1 and 2 Chronicles chapter 36. He put King Jehoiakim in fetters in preparation for transportation to Babylon. But as 2 Kings chapter 24 shows, he had second thoughts and decided to leave him in charge at Jerusalem as a puppet king. He did, however, take some prisoners, including the young man Daniel and his friends, who were selected for special training in Babylon. The Babylonian chronicle broadly confirms these events. It reads, In the 21st year, Nabopolassar stayed in his own land. Nebuchadnezzar, his eldest son, the crown prince, mustered and took command of the troops. He marched to Carchemish against the Egyptian army, accomplished their defeat, and beat them to non-existence. As for the rest, which escaped, the Babylonian troops overtook and defeated them. At that time, Nebuchadnezzar conquered the whole area of the Hatti country. The Hatti country included Palestine and Jerusalem. This was Nebuchadnezzar's first siege of Jerusalem. 2 more were to follow. 2 passages of scripture, 2 Kings chapter 24 and 2 Chronicles chapter 36, describe how Nebuchadnezzar again besieged Jerusalem in late 598 BC, Jehoiakim dying early in the siege. His 18-year-old son, Jehoiakim, ruled only 3 months and 10 days and was forced to surrender. The Babylonians entered the city in March 597 BC and took great treasures, carrying away King Jehoiakim together with 10,000 other captives, including all the skilled men and soldiers, leaving only the poorest people and appointing another puppet king, Jehoiakim's uncle Zedekiah. The Babylonian Chronicle bears this out, saying, "The king of Akkad mustered his troops, marching to the Hatti land, and encamped against the city of Judah, besieged the city, and captured the king. He appointed there a king of his own choice, received its heavy tribute, and sent them to Babylon." The young Ezekiel was among the captives taken to Babylon on this occasion. The biblical statement that King Jehoiakim was deported to Babylon is confirmed by other Babylonian tablets translated in the 1960s, which list rations given to prisoners between 595 and 590 BC. Jehoiakim is actually named as being supplied with monthly rations of oil and barley, together with his 5 sons. 3 oil receipts may be dated to 592 BC. The ration dockets are in the Pergamon Museum, Berlin. These 2 Babylonian chronicles vindicate the biblical record right down to minute details. There is a long gap in the Babylonian Chronicle tablets which have been so far discovered. This gap stretches from 595 to 556 BC and includes the last 33 years of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. Unfortunately, therefore, the Babylonian records are absent for the year 586 BC, when the puppet king Zedekiah in Jerusalem rebelled, and Nebuchadnezzar's troops were sent for the 3rd time to punish the city, leading to its destruction. Nebuchadnezzar reigned over the Babylonian Empire from 605 to 562 BC. This brick is stamped with the name and titles of Nebuchadnezzar and of his father. A mighty conqueror, he was also an outstanding builder, making Babylon the most spectacular city of ancient times, as the prophet Daniel tells us. The acting king of Babylon, Belshazzar, drank and boasted the evening away at a vast feast convened to celebrate Babylonian gods and achievements. Daniel chapter 5 verses 5 and 30 record, "In the same hour came forth fingers of a man's hand, and wrote over against the candlestick upon the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. In that night was Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, slain." Daniel gives an account of the events in the Babylonian palace just before the Medes seized and occupied the city, taking over its empire in the year 539 BC. Belshazzar is named as the feasting king, who promised Daniel that he would be the third ruler in the kingdom if he could interpret the writing on the wall. Before the mid-1800s, many scholars claim that this was sheer fiction on the part of the Bible, because the last king of Babylon was known to be Nabonidus, and the name Belshazzar was unheard of outside the book of Daniel. Even Herodotus, the Greek historian who wrote up the history of Babylon some 90 years later in 450 BC, had evidently never heard of Belshazzar. There seemed little hope for the accuracy of the book of Daniel. Inevitably, however, in 1854, Babylonian inscriptions began to yield up their evidence. These tell us that Nabonidus entrusted the kingship to his eldest son, while he himself lived in Timur in Arabia. The first invincible item of evidence for Belshazzar is the cylinder inscription of Nabonidus. This was found at the ziggurat at Ur. It records in Babylonian cuneiform how the ziggurat was reconstructed by Nabonidus. The record ends with a prayer, part of which asks for the religious life of Belshazzar, his son, calling him the firstborn son, the offspring of my heart. The Nabonidus Chronicle covers the years of Nabonidus from 556 to 539 BC, and says at one point, the king was in the city of Timur. The king's son, courtiers, and army were in Babylonia. Daniel's record has therefore been vindicated as truly historical, and we now know why Belshazzar, as co-regent, could only offer Daniel the third place in the kingdom. Nabonidus spent 10 years in Timur. His chronicle confirms the historic fall of Babylon, while Belshazzar ruled in 539 BC. We read, "The gods of Babylonia entered Babylon from every direction. When Cyrus attacked the Babylonian army, the people of Babylonia revolted. The troops of Cyrus entered Babylon without battle." Because Daniel made astounding and detailed prophecies in the 6th century BC about the course of future empires up to the time of Christ, critics of the Bible have insisted that the book of Daniel was written centuries later. We now have two clear confirmations that the book was written in the 6th century BC. First, the author of Daniel knew about Belshazzar, whose name had been completely forgotten 90 years later when Herodotus wrote, and remained unheard of until the archaeological discoveries of our time. Secondly, the author also knew that Babylon had been rebuilt by Nebuchadnezzar, as Daniel chapter 4 verse 30 shows, another fact that was unknown to later historians until the excavations of more recent times. In the same gallery as the Nabonidus Chronicle are the ancient Mesopotamian legends of creation and the flood from the Royal Library at Nineveh. The ancient creation story was discovered around 1848. The tablet on display is one of 7 copied in the 7th century BC from a much older version, thought to have been handed down from around 1800 BC. Cynics have claimed that this ancient epic, along with others, was the source of the Genesis account of creation. In the Mesopotamian story, the 2 original gods, Apsu the male and Tiamat the female, are created from water. They then beget all other gods, but these children make so much noise that Apsu is unable to sleep and decides to kill them. However, before he can do so, one of the offspring puts a spell on him and kills him. Tiamat, to avenge his death, takes up the cudgels, but Marduk, another offspring, eliminates her, splitting her in two, and the two parts of her corpse become the heavens and the earth. Marduk relieves the other gods of all manual work by creating man from the blood of a defeated giant god, and Marduk then becomes the chief god. Needless to say, none of this has anything in common with the biblical account of creation. Such legends do, however, bear witness to an instinctive human awareness that the universe was created by superior power. As far as creation is concerned, the Bible says that man was made in the image of one holy and almighty God. Then man disobeyed and lost his spiritual life, becoming a corrupt rebel. The Mesopotamian creation legend, by contrast, is a polytheistic fairyland, full of petty, corrupt, ill-tempered, and even vicious gods, who are merely a reflection of sinful people, and therefore a human literary creation. The other tablet to be viewed is the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of several ancient Mesopotamian flood stories. The tablet is the 11th of 12 tablets telling the adventures of Gilgamesh, a legendary ruler who searches for immortality. It is a 7th century BC version found in the Royal Library of Nineveh. Once again, biblical cynics claim that the Genesis account of Noah's flood was derived from ancient legends such as this. Rather wild remarks have been made to the effect that the Epic of Gilgamesh story follows the lines of that of Noah closely. However, as many scholars have pointed out, there are vast differences between the biblical and Mesopotamian accounts of the flood. Indeed, they form absolute opposites in many respects. The flood story in the Gilgamesh epic has some elements which are similar to the Genesis flood, although it must be said that a number of similarities are surely inevitable. To escape a flood, for example, one needs a boat, and to maintain life afterwards, one needs to take animals on board. Accordingly, the hero, Utnapishtim, had a boat, a cube 180 feet across, and took some animals with him, though not quite as Noah did. He also took gold and silver, a sure sign of human fiction, because he would hardly need such things if his family were to be the sole survivors of a worldwide flood. In the Genesis flood, as the waves abated, Noah sent out a raven and a dove, while the Gilgamesh boat sends out a dove, swallow, and raven. Overall, however, the accounts are characterized by numerous dissimilarities, such as when Utnapishtim offers a sacrifice to the gods, which touches off a row between them. The gods of this epic always emerge as materialistic, greedy, violent, proud, frightened, and vindictive creatures capable of unbelievably crude barbarism. Any similarities which occur between the Genesis and the Gilgamesh epic flood stories may be accounted for by the assumption that the Gilgamesh epic has its roots in an oral tradition stretching right back to a literal historic flood. Though subsequently evolving into pagan mythology, the surviving Babylonian legend of a great flood bears witness to a past reality. It is inconceivable that the writer of the overwhelmingly more sophisticated narrative of Genesis would have stolen anything from the primitive polytheistic legend. Far from such versions undermining the Genesis record, we believe that the superior dignity, theology, and language of the Genesis narrative marks it out as being inspired and true. On the way to the Persian Gallery, there are remains of Hittite art in the museum's room 54, the Hittites being first mentioned in Genesis chapter 15 and subsequently in numerous other passages, nearly 50 times in fact. The best-known individual Hittite in the Bible is Uriah, the husband of Bathsheba of 2 Samuel chapter 11. Joshua was given all the lands of the Hittites for conquest. Because they were unknown to secular historians, the Hittites were dubbed, quote, a mythical people and a figment of biblical imagination. But archaeological discovery, mainly in 1906 in Turkey, has provided considerable information about them. These so-called mythical people of the Bible turned out to be a major force in the ancient world. Indeed, we now know that their empire once stretched from Mesopotamia to Syria and Palestine, and that they spoke in an Indo-European language. The examples of Hittite art on display are from excavations at Carchemish. The Gallery of Ancient Iran, or Persian Gallery, contains a life-size tiled archer from the Palace of Susa, called in the King James Version Shushan the Palace, in Nehemiah, Esther and Daniel. The palace at Susa was built in 490 BC by Darius the Great and was decorated with friezes of glazed painted tiles in moulded relief. This is one of the emperor's bodyguard of archers, known as immortals, holding a spear. To Esther, the Jewess, who in 479 BC became queen to Xerxes I, king of Persia, Ahasuerus in the Bible, this would have been a familiar figure. This is the famous and priceless Cyrus cylinder, barrel-shaped, clay, and inscribed in cuneiform. It speaks of the wickedness of Nabonidus, the last king of Babylon, and of how Cyrus took Babylon in 539 BC without bloodshed, merging the Babylonian Empire with his own Medo-Persian dominions, confirming yet again the Daniel record. Cynical writers used to scoff at the idea that a 6th century BC Persian emperor would be so politically sophisticated as to release captive peoples and declare religious liberty. The opening words of the book of Ezra were often derided. Now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom, and put it also in writing, saying, Thus saith Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord God of heaven hath given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he hath charged me to build him an house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Who is there among you of all his people? His God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem and build. The discovery of the Cyrus cylinder silenced criticism because it proclaims the policy of Cyrus, who ruled 559 to 530 BC, to restore the liberty of foreign captives and to encourage them to return home, to worship according to their own traditions. It reads, As to the inhabitants of Babylon, I abolished the unpaid labor and denial of social standing. I brought relief to their derelict dwellings. I returned to the sacred cities on the other side of the Tigris, the sanctuaries of which had long been in ruins, the images which once lived in them, and established for them permanent sanctuaries. I also gathered their former inhabitants and returned them. Excavations at Ur and Uruk, 40 miles northwest of Ur, have also yielded up inscriptions stating that Cyrus personally authorized the restoration of temples in both these places. Thus, the statements made in chapters 1 and 6 of Ezra, as well as in the closing verses of 2 Chronicles, are authenticated from several local inscriptions, as well as from the annals of Cyrus. While Cyrus released captives of all nationalities, re-establishing their national shrines, God overruled in his heart and moved him to realize the all-surpassing importance of doing this for the house of the God of Israel. The Bible once stood alone in telling this story, but now the records of contemporaries place the essential facts beyond challenge. This, an official cylinder seal of Darius I, the agate cylinder seal, bearing his title in Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, the 3 official languages of the empire. It is possible that this is the Persian king's own seal, and if so, it would, in all probability, have appeared on the Temple Project proclamation. The seal is positioned alongside its rolled-out impression. It would have been used to emboss clay tablets to authenticate whatever had been inscribed in cuneiform script. This seal depicts Darius in his chariot, confronting and shooting a threatening lion during a hunt. First, it is helpful to know which Darius this is. After the fall of Babylon in 539 BC, a regional governor by the name of Darius ruled, serving under Cyrus. He is described in Daniel chapter 9, and also mentioned in chapters 6 and 11, where he is called Darius the Mede. He is not the Darius of this seal. After the regional ruler of this name had passed from the scene, another Darius came to prominence as king over the entire empire. This was Darius the Great, or Darius the First, who ruled from 521 to 486 BC. During his reign, the prophets Zechariah and Haggai ministered, and both mention him a number of times. So does Ezra many times, as he records the rebuilding of the temple. When obstructionists brought to a halt the rebuilding of the temple, an appeal was made to Darius I in 520 BC. He ordered a full investigation of the archives and found the original decree of Cyrus authorizing the project. Darius made a new proclamation, together with a total rebuilding grant recorded in Ezra chapter 6. Darius I maintained the policy inaugurated by Cyrus of encouraging foreign nationals to return to their homelands and to pursue their own religions. In an adjacent case, we can view silver tableware of the kind used at Esther's table. The silver bowl of Artaxerxes is inscribed, "Son of Xerxes, son of Darius." Xerxes is the Persian king known in the Bible as Ahasuerus, the son of Darius the Great. All 3 kings are referred to in Ezra chapter 4. Xerxes, Ahasuerus, succeeded his father Darius in 486 BC, ruling an immense empire from India to Ethiopia. In the record of the Bible, he deposed his queen, Vashti, replacing her in time with Esther. In 465 BC, after a 21-year reign and some 14 years after taking Esther as his queen, he was assassinated, his son Artaxerxes, 465 to 424 BC, succeeding him. It was Artaxerxes who brought the rebuilding of Jerusalem to a temporary halt, and who commissioned Ezra to visit the city as a kind of Secretary of State for Jewish affairs in 458 BC. 13 years later, this same king dispatched Nehemiah, his cupbearer, a member of the inner cabinet, to Jerusalem as civil governor. Artaxerxes was generally very kindly disposed to the Jews. So, one silver bowl commemorates 3 Persian kings prominent in biblical history. The Oxus treasure is displayed in this room, consisting of magnificent items from the 5th to 3rd centuries BC, showing the immense wealth of the Persian court. The treasure takes its name from the river Oxus, having been found at the site of an ancient city on its banks. All this confirms the portrayal of court splendor in the book of Esther. Such objects were part of the environment of the queen, and also later of Nehemiah. The Wolfson Gallery houses sculptures of Roman emperors who ruled during the life of Christ and the early New Testament period. These are undoubtedly good likenesses. Augustus reigned from 27 BC to AD 14. He was Caesar at the time of the birth of Christ, initiating the census just before his birth. During his reign, a golden age of Roman architecture and literature flourished. He founded the famous Praetorian Guard. Tiberius reigned next from AD 14 to 37 and was Caesar during the earthly ministry of Christ. In AD 26, he appointed Pontius Pilate governor of Judea. Jewish disturbances would have caused Tiberius to remove Pilate from office, and Pilate was mindful of this when Jewish leaders threatened to inform Caesar if Christ was released. Vespasian reigned from AD 69 to 79. Effectively successor to Nero, this frugal, efficient ruler rebuilt the economy and also cities crippled by earthquakes, such as some in Revelation chapters 2 and 3. Titus was virtual co-regent with Vespasian and reigned from AD 79 to 81 in his own right. As commander of Roman forces in Palestine, he conquered Jerusalem and destroyed the temple in AD 70. 2 coins from Nero's reign are also displayed here. It was during his reign that the apostles Peter and Paul were executed. The Gallery of Life in ancient Greece and Rome has many fascinating objects, most of which would have been familiar to people in the time of Christ and the 1st century, including instruments of the kind that would have been used by Dr. Luke and the mirrors of the day. The Money Gallery has a denarius from the reign of Tiberius Caesar on display. This is probably the very kind of denarius featured in Matthew 22. "Show me the tribute money," said Christ. And they brought unto him a penny. And he saith unto them, Whose is this image and superscription? They say unto him, Caesar's. Then saith he unto them, Render therefore unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. The Lullingstone wall decorations in room 49 are decorations from the earliest known Christian chapel in this country in the 4th century AD. At Lullingstone in Kent, a Roman villa had its top floor converted into a chapel, provided with its own outside public staircase and entrance. In the 19th century, part of the mosaic floor of this Roman villa was discovered when a fence was erected, and in 1949 a full excavation was begun by Lieutenant Colonel G.W. Meats. The villa, following a 5th century fire, had been abandoned, the upper floors collapsing into the basement. With many pots and wall decorations now reassembled and the history of the villa traced, it is evident that a wealthy Roman family practiced pagan rites in an adjoining temple and in basement rooms. However, from the 4th century, the occupying Roman family embraced Christianity, and the upper floor house church was prepared. Decorations showing a family at prayer, with the Shiro monogram with alpha and omega letters, the distinctive Christian symbols. This is Colonel Meats' reconstruction of the villa, not in the museum. Christianity was clearly established in Britain by this time through the Roman occupation and business travelling. Room 22 downstairs houses a massive base of a column from the Temple of Diana in Ephesus, the goddess mentioned in Acts 19. Paul's preaching led to a violent mob reaction, stirred up by the makers of shrines for Diana. Nearby in room 18 are the Elgin marbles from the Parthenon in Athens, built in the 5th century BC and dominating the city. Paul's whole being was repelled by all that the Parthenon represented, as well as by the many other pagan shrines in Athens. The architecture is unquestionably glorious, and the sculptures a work of human genius. But Acts 17 tells us that Paul's spirit was stirred up in him when he saw the city wholly given over to idolatry. In the course of his remonstrating with groups of people, he was invited by the philosophers of Athens to preach the sermon reported in Acts chapter 17 on Mars Hill. It is doubtful that Paul ever set foot in the Parthenon, any more than Christians would care to enter an active pagan temple today. However, a passing look at these sculptures will provide a vivid impression of the superstition that ruled the lives of Athenians. In Acts 17, Luke calls the city officials at Thessalonica politarchs, translated rulers of the city in the King James Version. This term was absent from Greek literature, and so prior to 1835, critics of the Bible did not hesitate to call Luke an unreliable historian. However, in 1835, the title politarch, with a list of rulers' names, was found on this 2nd century AD inscription on an arch in Thessalonica, proving that Luke was right and reliable after all. The Bible is always vindicated in the end. Similar inscriptions have turned up in other places subsequently. In Acts chapter 21, we read of how the Jews seized Paul in the temple at Jerusalem and stirred up the people to fury, charging him with having brought Gentiles into the temple. For they had seen before with him in the city Trophimus, an Ephesian, whom they supposed that Paul had brought into the temple. They were about to kill him when he was rescued by the Roman military, leading to imprisonment, many examinations, and trial in Rome. The temple warning notice was found in 1871 at the site of the temple and is dated AD 31. Positioned on a 4-foot-high marble wall separating the outer court of the temple area from the rest, it is written in Greek only, as it does not apply to Jews. It warns no Gentile may enter the enclosing screen around the temple. Whoever is caught will have himself to blame that his death results. It is housed in the Archaeological Museum in Istanbul. It is often thought that the Bible must have changed greatly through many years of copying from manuscript to manuscript. If it were a purely human work, this would no doubt be the case. The Dead Sea Scrolls, which include 2nd century BC scriptures, have shown the astonishingly accurate preservation of the Old Testament. And here we see an example of a New Testament fragment. Such fragments confirm the accuracy of the transmission of the New Testament text. This one, to be seen in the John Rylands Library in Manchester, written in Greek and dated by experts at AD 125 to 150, bears on one side John's Gospel chapter 18 verses 31 to 33, and on the other verses 37 to 38. It is clearly a page of a book, a codex, and not part of a scroll. Christians were evidently using the book format long before it became general for Greek literature. This fragment contains Pilate's famous question, "What is truth?" and also the words of Christ, "Everyone that is of the truth heareth my voice." What better words are there to bring to a close a review of evidence for the inspired and infallible Bible? Its history is always verified by archaeological discovery, and its message of new life from Christ is always proved true by the experience of those who trust in him.